Welcome to Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Joy Sullivan, where we get it straight. Our featured guest today, and I want to thank him for returning, is Ben Kinsley, who's going to be discussing with us the task force on education and what's been going on. They had their first meeting. Ben, welcome and thank you for joining us. You're such an expert on this matter, and I'm so thrilled to have you with us.
Thanks, Linda. Appreciate it. And always love being on your show. So it's a good time.
Thank you. Would you be so kind just to refresh our constituents on your background, what you're doing, how you've been involved with watching legislature, and let's really bring them up to speed, and then we'll get into the down and dirty.
Sure. Yeah, there's lots to dive into. I've worked working in public policy in Vermont for well over a decade at this point, and public education is one of the areas that I focus on. The last several years, I've worked with Campaign for Vermont, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy group that is focused on building the middle class in Vermont and addressing challenges that everyday Vermonters are facing. So, and obviously, one of the areas that we've spent a lot of attention is, I call them the twin crises of property taxes and education quality. So really since 2010, we've seen a decline in the outcomes for our students in Vermont, despite skyrocketing property taxes. So we spend 80% more than the national average on a per student basis. We're actually, middle of the pack at face value, and some recent work shows that middle of the pack in terms of outcomes, I should say. But when we adjust for Vermont's demographics, the fact that we have a lower poverty rate than the nation as a whole, we have less diverse classrooms, fewer language learners, so folks that are non-native speakers than the nation as a whole. When you account for those factors, we're actually in the bottom third, and in some cases, like the bottom 10 states.
10, yeah, right.
Yeah. So not pretty. And we're spending top dollar. We're not getting top dollar results. And so that is a big focus for us, because we want to see both our students succeed, because that builds the next generation. But we also want to make sure we're not crushing the current generation with cost of living via property taxes.
Right, and it's very difficult to identify exactly where the dollar actually is going, which we'll get into some of these points today.
And all of these things wrap into Act 73.
Exactly. And so today we are going to be speaking about that in our task force, okay, which is very clearly has a job ahead of them, right? And I think that they realize this is not just let's jump in there, but also that they're just there to give recommendations, that the legislature actually has the ability to put together their own position. So
Yes.
We're going to see they had their first meeting. Were you able to review any of the minutes from that meeting? And if you did, what's your gut feeling right off the top?
Yeah, I mean, their first meeting was the Friday before last, and I think the takeaway at this point is they're still getting their feet under them. They're trying to understand what their charge is, and what they're responsible for doing. And as you pointed out, Senator Beck reminded everyone at the beginning, like, we're just putting forward a plan. Like, that is what we're doing at the end of the day. The budget had accounted, the budget that the legislature gave them had accounted for 7 meetings between now and the end of the year. And the Agency of Education was quick to point out that is only 7 budgeted meetings. Members could choose to meet more frequently than that, but they would forego their stipend if they did so, which honestly may happen. I think the meeting agenda that they put out is basically every 2 weeks, roughly. And I don't know that they're going to have the bandwidth to do all of that work by the end of the year, meeting every other week. I will say one of the interesting things that I did take away from that first like sort of organizational meeting is the level of support that the administration is offering. So, it's clear Governor Scott is throwing all of the resources of state government behind this effort. Not only was the Secretary of Education there, but the Secretary of Administration was there. A number of deputies were there. The tax commissioner, like basically all the heavy hitters in the administration of state government were at this meeting and offering their support any way that they could.
But this
So
is serious. I
it's
mean,
serious. Yeah. And unlike some other legislative initiatives where the governor is kind of like, okay, we're going to do the minimum, the administration's like, we're going to do the minimum required here. They're throwing extra resources at this that the bill itself, legislation did not call for. Like the legislation did not say the Secretary of Education has to be in the room or the Secretary of Administration has to be in the room. That was the governor's directive to say, like, I want my top people in the room, making sure that the resources to do this are there.
and taking that to expect that they would not be there would kind of be a validation that this was something that was just fluff. And this is not fluff. This is a whole reorganization of the
Yeah.
state's education system.
Whether or not it's going to be successful is a different question, but I agree.
Different
It's
animal.
not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, that's a different story. It may be that they have to revisit it. They need to put different people on. They need not. Something successful may come from this, but this is serious. And if you are going to have a legislature that's going to vote on a recommendation or bring forth their own, which means they're still going to vote on this, a yay or a nay, right? The bottom line is the administration needs to be participating and understand what their arguments for or against are going to be. And the fact that our Secretary of Education and administration are there says they're serious and they're paying attention, and they will provide appropriate resources that they are authorized to do to make sure that this is not just a little study group.
Yes. Yeah. And I will say, looking at who else was in the room, yeah, it's clear this is a serious effort. The members of the task force seem to be taking it seriously. And just to frame, I don't think we've talked about what this task force is actually supposed to be doing.
Yes. Which we're going to get to next.
We'll get there. Okay. Great.
Yeah. So, and let's start that. I mean, we have a task force, and they actually were charged with putting together 3 maps with boundaries, but they're charged with more than that. And they actually, I think, started by electing co-chairs and to start this off. And good for them. But right now, this is a huge undertaking. And it can't just be, let's go in and chop up something and say, oh, we have to come up with 3 maps, so therefore here it is, and we'll worry about it later. So do you want to go into what they are actually charged with and what their reaction was as they're starting their first meeting?
Yeah. So I think that's a great starting place, is like, and that was where they started, quite honestly, is understanding what their charge is, what are they responsible for. And one of the things that we've seen, like the news reports will talk about this as the redistricting task force, and they may even talk about it as like the charge generally being to redraw the school district map. It's actually broader than that. You look at the actual language in the bill, it's clear that it is not just school districts, it is the entire governance structure. And we have really 4 different governance structures, maybe 5, depending on how you want to count, in Vermont today. So we have school districts, obviously, that's a governance structure. That's your local school board, runs the school district. We have supervisory unions, which provide services to school districts, primarily special education Your superintendents live at the supervisory union level in the state. There is a supervisory union board. They're usually elected by school boards that are members of that supervisory union. And then we have supervisory districts. So this is the third one, and that is a combined school district and supervisory union. So they are one structure. Um, so there's one board that does the supervisory union functions and the school district functions. Um, and then there is layered on top of that a career and technical education center district, and that has its own board, and there are member SUs of that career and technical education center. So, and then on top of that, we have this new structure that was introduced a couple of years ago called BOCES, or Boards of Cooperative Education Services. The idea for those is that they're going to be like bulk purchasing and maybe some like highly specialized education services that they might provide. And those are still forming. So those are, there's maybe going to be a half dozen of those across the state. So if you kind of think about it, and then at the very top, you'd say like the Agency of Education maybe is the top governance structure. So there's like 5 or 6 different levels of governance structure. There's obviously one education agency, maybe a half dozen BOCES at some point in the future once those have fully formed. 17 career and technical education centers. So there's 17 of those. 52 supervisory unions. So you're getting kind of larger, and 119 right. School districts as of today. That's down from 180 something
from the former Act.
Yeah, so prior to Act 153 and then Act 46, we had 280 something school districts. We're down to 119. We didn't change the number of supervisory unions too much, though, and we can dive into that and what the impacts of that are. But
and I think we should, because this particular task force is, changing the governance. And that is actually the key here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in my mind.
We have a lot of layers of administration, and that's something that's really worth pointing out. And Act 46 did not address that, all the layers of education administration that we have. It really focused on the very bottom tier, the districts. And there's not a ton of administration. There are some, but not a ton of administration that happens at that level, because the largest expense for on administration for those folks are going to be your principals and staff. Like the school boards don't have dedicated staff, and the school boards are volunteer organizations. So getting rid of school boards does not necessarily save you money. And that's one of the reasons why when we look back at Act 46, and it's really hard to find cost savings. And in fact, more often than not, we find cost drivers from Act 46 versus cost savings.
And the key, too, is to remember that all of this, whether all these layers and this whole governance change, is going to affect the outcomes of the students, the pupils, right?
Exactly.
Which should be top priority. How do you balance that?
I think it's important to balance both the voices of the property taxpayers and the outcomes of the students, because what ends up happening, and I think we're in a dangerous spot now, where taxpayers start demanding cuts, and school boards are going to start cutting the easiest things that they can, or the only things that they can, and sometimes those things are not beneficial to students, right? So we've got to balance those two things, because ultimately, if you don't manage your finances well, that is also going to negatively impact students. So you need to have a manageable cost profile in order to maintain the public support you need in order to provide quality education to students. So it's a balancing act. And right now we have, that's why I call them the twin crises, because we have both things happening at the same time, where education quality is dropping, property taxes are skyrocketing, and that is a recipe for disaster for our students.
So is this task force, do you think, going to actually come up with a legitimate cost analysis? Are we going, or are they just going to generalize? And I mean, where are they getting their numbers from? Who's doing the number crunching? Who's going to come in and defend those numbers and defend their new redistricting, defend the changes of their governance with only a few meetings, right? 12 max, right? Can they do this?
Well, 7 that are paid for, and then if
Right.
they
Well, let's,
volunteer their
yeah.
time, they can meet more often than that. But
Right, but I give them, I do believe that in all sincerity, they will meet more. I'm
yeah,
hoping they will. I don't think their stipend is really what's driving these people. I think they really want to get in there and do it right. My concern, of course, is that they have their, it's just an opinion from them.
right.
And so they always have that out of, well, we made our recommendation and, the legislature can throw theirs out there and then we can hash it out later, which kind of can force not a laziness, but we'll get to it when we go back to session.
I think, without getting too far afield here, because I think there's, but I think one of the advantages of the structure of this task force, and I think we talked about it last time, is the number of legislators that are on there. There's quite a few legislators that are members of this task force, and one of their roles here is to make sure that whatever the task force produces is going to be politically viable in the legislature. It's going to get taken seriously and not just tossed aside. And I think that is an advantage in this case of having those members that really create an anchor back to the final decision makers, which is going to be the legislature. So I think that's important. One of the other things you sort of touched on in terms of like the scope of the work here and whether or not it's going to be successful in terms of creating a policy that makes sense, but also one that's viable from both a data standpoint and a political standpoint. One of the things we lobbied the legislature on, and we lobbied this campaign for Vermont, was to make sure that the charge for this task force was broader than just school districts. For exactly the same reasons that Act 46 failed. And we were involved in the Act 46 process too, by the way. And we had put a lot of the things that we cautioned the legislature on in 2015 when they passed Act 46, ended up being the pitfalls for that legislation. And we can see that now more clearly a decade later. And so we were very adamant with the legislature when they were working on this bill that it needs to be broader than just school districts. It needs to be the entire governance system. And you mentioned that they're responsible with coming up with as many as 3 maps. At least one of those maps has to contemplate the use of supervisory unions and supervisory districts as the mechanism to achieve scale.
But only one does.
That's the one that's required. They're required
Right.
to come up with a map that does that, and then they can come up with 2 more maps.
That's right. And if their justification of the other maps is superior, then they can defend all 3 before the legislature, and
Yeah.
that's their job as well. And that's my question. Is it their job to defend it or just submit it?
I think there is going to be some defense of it, for sure, especially and it depends on how bought in they are. And something we talked about last time we spoke is that there's a lot of different viewpoints on this task force, a lot of people coming at this from different angles. I think it's going to be difficult for them to get to consensus. And so part of the success and how, the end product and also, the consensus around that end product and how able they are as a group to lobby for it will really depend on how the process unfolds, I think, and whether or not they're able to find that consensus of here is the path forward and take into account all the different voices that are part of the conversation. Because, we already heard in the first meeting, the public comments section, people are very concerned about losing their local schools. And
Right.
and losing the connection to their local schools, right? And we're seeing one person cited research we're seeing now. Even next door in Massachusetts, there's a lot of research they're doing. Mass Inc., for example, just
Right.
published a report last year that showed how important those local community ties are between, local schools and their community. And part of the concern is when you get, to a certain geographic size where, a school board is so large, you start losing those connections when you look at that type of scale. And of course, Massachusetts is one of the best performing school districts in the world, school
Right.
systems in the world. So there's something to learn from that, right? Is
That's
that
right. So it's not a negative. I mean, there are positives to that as well.
Mhm.
So they also, you just touched on it, the geography. I mean, we've got mountains, we've got issues with transportation. So how do you think this task force is going to be able to take those issues, which
Yeah,
I don't think those are as difficult issues as the number crunching and the outcomes.
yeah.
But how do we think that they're going to take that first and say this is feasible or not feasible?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult at the district level in particular because we're on the heels of this Act 46 process, which was basically an incentive-driven process of like asking every school district in the state to look at their neighbors and figure out, does it make sense for us to collaborate in some way? And because that was to some degree a locally driven process. I mean, there were forced mergers, about a dozen of them, but for the most part, it was a locally driven process. It was asking school districts to look at their neighbors and see if there was anything that made sense to do. And for the most part, districts did that. School boards did that. And I think so that was a potential positive of Act 46 to encourage that, and that sort of also built in that geographic aspect of like this town is culturally not connected, or there's a mountain in the way. It's not just you can't just draw lines on a map and connect these, but that is what the Act 73 process is. This is a very top
Right.
down process, unlike Act 46, which was more bottom up, and it is a group of people. This task force is a group of people sitting in a room drawing a map, saying, okay, we're combining this town and this town and this district and that district. And, geographic and cultural issues are going to be a thing. And,
And the number of students in
and
those
number of students.
rural, yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean, from
And how
4,000
long,
students or 200 students, right?
and how long kids are going to be on buses. Right. And that's one of the things, that people are really concerned about. We heard that from parents, even in this first meeting. They're really worried about their kids being on a school bus because they get merged into this gigantic district, and then eventually down the road that district chooses to close one of their schools, and now their kids are on a bus for 90 minutes. And
And once they're there, if there's an issue and the parent needs to go get their child,
yeah,
so that's also a consideration. It's
yeah,
how, I mean, the biggest fear of a parent is that, it takes you more than 5 minutes to get to your child, right?
yes,
So
yeah,
now you're talking about, well, it's going to take me a day
yeah. I
to
have to
get
go.
all of this done, right?
Yeah, I have to go like drive 45 minutes to the school that my kid is at, pick them up because they're sick, or there's a disciplinary issue or whatever the case may be. And so those are all, I think, legitimate concerns. And the other issue too is if your school's that far away, like we
Mhm.
talked about those community connection issues. Like you're not going to volunteer at that school. You're not, you're probably not going to attend that school board meeting either, or it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to do that. So that you do start, I think there's a Goldilocks ratio. There's obviously too small. And if you could dial the clock back 100 years, we had school boards for every single school. We had single school districts. Like, so there's one school per district. And that was obviously too small to achieve any sort of scale. And so, we have this, we went from, could have been several hundred or even a couple thousand schools and school districts to, what we have today. There's a big consolidation effort in the late 1800s. There was another one in the 1970s where the union high schools got formed. And now, we had one in 2010 to 2020, basically, that took it from 280 schools down to, or school districts rather, down to 119, 120. And so I think there's a Goldilocks range where there's like enough, scale to, enough scale to achieve, but not so large that it's unwieldy. Because one of the other things I think is you get boards that have too many schools that they're responsible for. And this is one of my biggest concerns. And I think this happened a little bit during Act 46, which is why I think we're maybe already in that Goldilocks range for districts themselves, potentially, is because we saw quality drop during the Act 46 consolidations, right? We saw quality decline. One of the reasons for that, in my opinion, is because, if you're a school board member and you've got 3 schools, let's say, in your district, it's probably feasible that you know what's going on in every single one of those schools, right? You know what the principal's doing, most of the teaching staff, like what's happening in those schools. But you scale that up to suddenly you're responsible for a dozen schools as a school board member. There's no way you know what's going on in every single one of those schools, right? And so there, that loss of connection, even as a school board member, I think impacts the focus on quality and outcomes of the students, where you're just looking at a sheet.
Yeah, so talk about actually the school board members. I mean, they're elected, appointed, and so how will that become diverse? That's also before the task force, correct, to consider?
So the task force charge is, it is going to impact school boards, right? Because it's going to be, because some school boards may cease to exist. In fact, quite a few may cease to exist depending on which way the task force goes. Like I said, we have 119 districts today. That's 119 school boards. If the task force decides to focus just on districts the way that Act 46 did, based on those numbers, like the administrative size for the maps has to be between 4,000, roughly 4,000 and 8,000 students.
8,000, right.
So if they choose to focus on districts, that means we're going from 119 districts to somewhere between 10 and 20, just based on that on the numbers provided in the legislation. And that would mean over the last 20 years, we've gone from 280 something districts down to as few as 10 in 20 years, with very little to show for it at this point, being in the middle of that process. So I think, and that would mean that a whole bunch of school boards are just going to cease to exist, right? About 100 are going to just cease to exist.
So since they're charged with governance, and this all falls under that, can this task force decide that they are going to expand the school districts by incorporating the ones that may have been removed and putting them into the larger ones, and then they have to go back to the legislature because of the statutes that are already in place?
I don't think we're going to be adding school districts back. There are some districts.
Blending, like if you're turning around and you're saying, okay, this school district is going to go, but we still need a voice from this district. Can we then go in as a task force and say this particular district that is going to become obsolete, can we say that they need to now be merged into the one we're keeping so that there's a voice from that district?
Yeah, so there were some interesting things that happened in Act 46, the way that they merged. And and some of that was in proportional versus non-proportional representation on the new merged districts. Some of the new operating agreements when districts merged precluded the closure of any schools for either forever or for at least a certain amount of time, like 5 or 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some creative things that school districts did themselves as they were merging in Act 46. I think it is hard to guarantee a voice for
Yeah.
a small town that's getting merged into a district with a larger town, and we're seeing some districts now they're trying to unmerge because of that, because they feel like they're now getting bullied by the larger town that they're in a district with. So there's some efforts to unwind Act 46 in certain areas because of that. And in other areas where they've been unsuccessful in doing that, they've actually seen the larger town vote to close a school in the smaller town. We've seen two examples of that now following Act 46, and that was exactly what people were worried about. And so I think a lot of smaller towns today are looking at that experience saying, oh, that could be us next, right? This new consolidation effort, we get merged into a larger town, aside from all the other things we've talked about. And they're like, our school that we have today that we love could be closed because then our town could vote 100% against it, but it doesn't matter because this bigger town up the road could outvote us.
What reservations did you pick up on from the task force first meeting? What reservations did they have?
Yeah, I think they are focused on quality, which is good, and trying to understand what quality means. They're also interested in following data. I think there is a predisposition towards consolidation. We have the a couple people on there that are already speaking out about the benefits of consolidation. One of them is Kim Gleason, who is on the State Board of Education during the Act 46 process and is already advocating for the benefits of consolidation as she sees them. And as well as Jay Badams, who is the outgoing superintendent for the Norwich district. It's the interstate district. It's the Norwich and Hanover school district right on the New Hampshire border. So he's the outgoing superintendent there, and he oversaw a massive consolidation in Pennsylvania, where he was a superintendent. I think one of the key things there that he mentioned in that consolidation effort that he was leading is that they cut their teaching staff massively when they did that. And that did not happen in Act 46.
Right.
And there's no guarantee it would happen consolidating districts today if that's the route that Act 73 goes. Vermont has the smallest student-teacher ratio in the country by far.
Right.
It's 20% below the next highest district or next highest school system. And there's emerging evidence that actually when you have class sizes as small as Vermont's, like we're sort of pre-programmed from the last 20, 30 years of school research to say, oh, smaller class sizes are better. But most of that research says it's moving from, 30 students per class down to like 18 to 20 students per class. There's benefits. Vermont is at 10 students. Our student-teacher ratio is closer to 10. And there's really no evidence, no research that says class sizes that small are beneficial. And in fact, some new research is starting to indicate it's actually harmful when you have class sizes that small. So not only does it cost more, it also is probably not benefiting students. It's certainly not benefiting them more than having, 15 students per class, which is the national average.
Right. And I know, years ago, there were 30, 35 students in a class. And I mean, I was one of those. I think I turned out okay. But of course, I'm voting for myself as saying I turned out okay. But you focus, I mean, it's also, the teachers as well, and how they approach their classroom as well. and the disciplinary tactics and what their focus is and their lesson plans and their education, their licensing requirements. So in the first meeting, I believe Representative Holcomb, who was, the former Secretary of Ed, she had reservations and she had some comments. Are you familiar with what her positions were that day?
Yeah, I think she's conflicted a little bit. She's got a lot going on. And by the way, she was Secretary of Education during Act 46.
Right.
And so I think she has multiple perspectives on this, and I do think she's going to emerge to be one of the leaders in this group as they think about things. She obviously is worried about quality, but wants to follow data and what the data is saying. And there was some challenges, not necessarily from her. She was sort of the note taker in the first meeting, so like we didn't hear too much from her specifically. But I think she was organizing the conversation in an interesting way, and something that one of the co-chairs said, Senator Gulick, and Holcomb sort of added on to it, is there's sort of this built-in assumption that consolidation saves money. And there was a suggestion that they actually dig into the data behind that, which we've done, by the way. We've looked at the Act 46 data, and there really was no cost savings there. And the reason being, we can sort of jump into why that is, but there was a recognition from Senator Gulick that we're taking this at face value, this assumption that bigger is better, and we really need to look at whether or not that's true. And Holcomb sort of jumped on that bandwagon as well and said, yeah, we should look at that. And so I'm hopeful that this district is going to look more broadly at and holistically at the entire governance structure, and what we can do there, and not just at districts like Act 46 did. And that's really where I think it went awry right at the beginning.
And what about the politically energized issue of, municipalities and the local community saying, you're not taking away our control again?
Yeah, and I think that I'm already seeing that same sort of energy that we saw in opposing Act 46, the forced mergers in particular. That energy is out there, and the fears are a little more substantial this time because there's some recent trauma, perhaps, regarding that. Right. And the organization's better. In Act 46, there was like pockets of resistance around the state where a couple school districts got together and were like, we don't like this, we're going to try to oppose it and fight it and whatnot. What I'm seeing this time around is that the Rural School Alliance, which is a group that formed last year and started lobbying, they're already being effective. They definitely influenced the path of Act 73 in the legislature, and they already have 100 districts that are members. So remember, we have 120 districts statewide.
Right, so they've got the majority there.
This alliance is almost all of them minus 20. Of course, it's like the 20 biggest ones that are not part of the Rural Schools Alliance. But
right. So, and we have legislators on the task force, and how will they be influenced by this rural district organization?
I think this Rural Community Schools Alliance has teeth. I think they have teeth and they have support. And one of the other things that we are seeing is that they're starting to become just as legitimate of a voice as the Vermont School Boards Association. Vermont School Boards Association is supposed to be the lobbying group that represents all school boards across the state. But they were in favor of school consolidations. They were in favor of Act 46. They supported that. They supported they did not strongly oppose, actually, let's phrase it that way, not strongly oppose the governor's 5 school districts model, which would have meant, again, a lot of school board members um, you know, hitting the street because those school boards would be dissolved. So I think all that to say, we're actually seeing school districts and school boards leave the school board association and join this community schools alliance. Obviously, a lot of them are members of both, but we're seeing some that are saying we're not paying dues to the school boards association anymore. They no longer represent us. We're throwing our monetary support behind the rural school alliance.
Do we know if the task force has an opinion on this organization? I mean, of
Not
course, they're allowed to do
directly.
what they want, but I'm saying, is the task force saying, okay, we need to pay attention because this is a strong voice that can influence our own decision, or are they comfortable enough with their own charge that says everybody can speak and do what they want? We need to do our own analysis as the members.
Yeah, I think generally the legislators that are on the task force are more closely aligned with the school boards association. Um, they're the two co-chairs of the task force both have strong ties with the school boards association. They're both former school board members. Actually, one of them may be a current school board member, and
Hmm.
both of them are active in the VSBA. So I think that certainly the leadership of the task force is more closely aligned with the School Boards Association, the VSBA, but they are receptive, at least somewhat, to the Rural School Alliance. And that group did testify in the first meeting, saying, here are the things that we're really concerned about, and we're encouraging the task force to look at, and we're going to do the same thing. By the way, we're going to go in
Right.
talk about some of these issues and what we saw as the pitfalls of Act 46 and how this task force can navigate around them.
So the Rural School Alliance may find it more strategically strength-worthy for them to go before the legislature, where
Yeah,
they have their individual representatives on all of these 100 different community schools or districts, and fight there to help them with the plan that most probably will come out of the legislature to be considered over whatever the task force comes out with.
yeah, they definitely have legislative sway. There's no question, and part of that is just like the nature of how many districts are members of them, or members of that group. So, like, I do think that they have more legislative sway than they do over this particular task force.
Right. So, what else did you pick up on? Because I kind of want to let you run with this because you're such an expert in this area from this task force. What are their issues? I mean, this is hopes and dreams, and we don't want hopes and dreams. We want reality. We want number crunching. We want to see what could really benefit the students, what the outcomes are. I mean, this is a lot, this whole restructuring of governance. So, I'm going to let you run with this now, and then I'll pop in and rein you in.
Yeah. I think that we sort of talked about one of the things that was missing in the conversation is bending the cost curve. Like that was not talked about a whole lot. But that is of course like what drove this conversation, right? And I think that that is the thing that Governor Scott's very concerned about, why he's throwing all of these resources to assist the task force. So I think that the administration will continue to nudge the task force to say, like, okay, remember, it's yes, we want to quality of outcomes, right? We want education quality to be a part of the focus, but this crisis is forefront because of property taxes, and we need to figure out how to reduce costs. And so I think that will be a continuous topic of conversation, even though it wasn't mentioned all that much in the initial meeting. I think I was encouraged to hear several members talk about wanting to really dive into the data, because we've done that, and we see what the data is saying, for the most part.
Can you
So
explain a little bit more about the data? What data? Where is
yeah,
it coming from?
there's all kinds of data that you can look at, and so for example, the outcomes of the Act 46 mergers, like whether or not they saved money, why did they not save money if they didn't, what areas, what areas were there savings during Act 46, and which areas were there additional costs, and things like that. That data exists. There was a research study done at Yale that came out recently regarding that. We have also seen some of that data as well in some of our public policy research. For example, we knew, and this was true before Act 46, and it's still true today, larger districts in Vermont do not perform better on a cost or a performance standpoint. So
Yeah.
that
And
is
if
an
I
issue.
remember correctly, when they did the mergers with Act 46, there was also that initial transferring of liability that was
Yes.
existent. So that also skews cost factors, et cetera. So, that you have to look at that, what they absorbed. So there was that influence in decisions that were made that way. Your balance sheet is completely skewed for a couple of years, because you're
Yes.
absorbing specific debt. And
Debt
so,
or deferred maintenance or anything like that. So that does skew things to the first couple of years. The other really, so the Yale study was interesting because it looked at specific spending categories to understand like where were the savings and where were the costs, and there were some savings on administration. Not surprisingly, when you combine business offices and HR functions, you have some savings. Um, and But the interesting thing is that on the flip side of that, the cost drivers were transportation. Not too surprisingly, you spend more on transportation. Actually, spent more on materials, which was interesting. It's not super intuitive, but the really big cost driver from mergers was personnel costs, staffing costs, and
administrative
no,
costs,
this is teacher salaries,
teachers' salaries.
specifically, and because you're
Okay.
saving a little bit
So
on
they
administration.
rose, the teacher salaries rose because they added more teachers? Or they just
Not
kept the amount of teachers without saying, we don't want to cut?
right, and that's what happened for the most part. So what happened is that the teacher staffing basically remained pretty flat during Act 46. Like there was not any, there really were not any instructional staff cuts during Act 46, unlike the Jape Adams situation in Pennsylvania where
Okay.
they cut staffing significantly. That did not happen during Act 46. And instead, what happened is when they combine these school districts, right? Let's say you go merge three districts, and one district is paying their teachers at an average of $70,000 a year. The next district is paying $60,000 a year, and the third district is paying $50,000 a year. What do you think the new district is going to pay their teachers?
Well, there
They're
you
gonna
go, right? The
they're gonna
higher, yeah,
pay everyone at the $70,000
70.
rate because no one wants to take a pay cut. So what they have to do is they end up raising the contract to the highest common denominator out of the old districts because no one wants to tell someone they're getting a pay cut when they merge the district. So that
So
is
does
where
that actually hold as the law, or do they have to look at, who's vested and so on, and who they're going to keep and things like that? So, I mean, contracts that are in place. So is it might not be mandatory to raise. It might be politically correct,
right.
but that's part of not the governance. Well, that would be the analysis maybe from the governance structure, but the choice of who's hired or who stays would then go to the new districts themselves, correct?
Yeah, when the new districts organize, they're making that decision
which says that they
about
may choose to
scales.
keep those who work for their district as opposed to bringing in others from the outside districts that are no longer in existence.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, the way that Act 46 played out, and this was not mandated in the law, but this is like
Mhm.
to your point. But the way that it played out on the ground is the new districts basically kept all the staff from the old districts, so the teaching staff from the old districts, but upped the contracts to the most generous contract in among the old districts, which is what created that cost driver. So like they're not letting anyone go necessarily, but they're now paying most of the or a good chunk of the staff more than they were before, and that's where the cost driver is, and that was ended up being almost $1,300 a student in costs
Mhm.
for Act 46. And so again, if you're looking at just districts, which districts employ teachers, you're going to have those same dynamics moving forward, and there's maybe ways to mitigate that in the future, like in a Act 73 merger scenario, there may be a way to mitigate that. But that's sort of human nature of like, oh, we don't want to cut anyone's salary,
Of
so
course.
we're just going to level everyone up.
Right. So also the field of study of teaching is going to influence that as well. I mean, the special education, the arts, or what they're keeping, the subject matter, English teachers, and so on, and the science teachers, and who's actually, are they merging what you're teaching? It's so, I mean, they need to look at that as
Yeah.
well. So when they do this redistricting, they need to say, what is the quality of education going on in these districts, and where are their strengths in the areas, the subject matter areas.
And
So
I think that
there's, go ahead.
and I think that's one of the issues, like when I talked about earlier, of like when school boards start losing focus on what is happening in their districts and their schools that they're responsible for. I think that school boards should be the first line of defense when things start going sideways. They should be the ones to say, why are these students not achieving the outcomes we would expect, right? They should be the first ones looking at that. But when you get just too large of a scale, you're responsible for too many schools, you start losing focus on some of those things, I think.
Mhm.
And That's why I think there's this Goldilocks zone of like, you're not too big that you're losing that level of focus and those community connections between your community, your local school board, and your school. But you're achieving some level of scale. And I think really, and we put out a policy proposal on this back in March. And I think for us, what we really recommend, and we're going to recommend this to the task force in terms of overall governance, is for the most part, leave our current school board configuration in place, and instead focus on those supervisory unions as the mechanism to achieve scale. We already provide some services to school districts at the SU level, like special education, like we were talking about, but we can do a lot more. We could do HR functions at the SU level. We could do, AR and AP at the SU level, uh, maintenance, transportation, even specialized classes like language, arts,
Mhm.
things like that could be provided by the SU and achieve some of that scale. And for example, like say it's a language class that only in a high school that only meets 2 or 3 times a week. Well, that teacher could be at a different high school the other 2 or 3 days of the week teaching that same class. Can't do that in our current configuration. And that's one of the reasons people say we need larger districts, but you don't necessarily need larger districts to do that. You could just move those services from the district level to the SU level.
So you brought up, the Goldilocks, and I love fairy tales. Um,
Who doesn't,
but it
right?
also sounds to me like we're dealing with the big bad wolf of blow your school down, right? So you've got two things going on here, and these are major issues that I feel for this task force, and I appreciate the administration saying, "We're here. We're going to participate in resources, our ears. We're going to see how we can assist to make sure that this doesn't become the big bad wolf blow your school down, and it actually is a true Goldilocks kind of analysis, because that's what it is. I mean, you hit it. That's exactly what it is. What else do you see is their real issue here? Because I know we're running out of time, and I want to make sure I get everything you want to say, and I can't wait
Yeah.
to invite the task force on so we could all really find out as they're moving along what's going on.
I think that their issue, like I said at the beginning, is going to be finding consensus, and there's a number of places that you can get hung up on trying to find that consensus. I think there is a predisposition on the task force towards district consolidation, but there's also voices on the task force that want to follow the data and are skeptical of district consolidation given the experience with Act 46. So I think that there's a lot of places that you can go sideways, and getting rid of local school boards is certainly going to be one of them that there's going to get pushback on. That's going to be politically difficult,
Do you think
especially.
we've had enough time with Act 46 to actually say that the data from Act 46 is something that they can really rely upon?
So it's been a decade at this point.
But we had
There,
COVID in there too.
yes, COVID muddies the waters for sure. COVID muddies the waters. There was basically 1 year of data prior or after Act 46 and before COVID that you can look at that's relatively clean. Um, and then COVID messes with it quite a bit after that in terms of both cost and outcomes. But I think that even if you look at individual district levels, like anecdotally look at case studies of what's happened, the Vail study, I think, is, or the Vail study, the Yale study
Yeah.
is
Hmm.
pretty.
Yeah, that's a good study, right? Do
Yeah, I
you
think it's
think that Act 46 is there data to identify whether or not from the Act 46 merges many students went into being either homeschooled or private schools? Do we have that data as well?
we know that happened a lot during COVID. So
Right.
COVID was a driver of that, where parents were pulling their kids out of public schools because of the public school reaction to COVID, and we know that most of the kids that stayed saw pretty drastic declines in outcomes, more so than the nation as a whole. I mean, the whole country saw declines during COVID, but Vermont's were particularly stark. But it's also worth pointing out our student outcomes were declining before that.
Right.
We sort of peaked
That's right.
2015, 2016, right at the start of the Act 46 consolidations. And it's been sliding before that. And, when you point out how poor our outcomes are today, people's first reaction is COVID. And it's like, there's more to the story than that. It's like it was declining before COVID. COVID obviously accelerated that, but then it's also been declining since COVID. So like we have
So it's gone back to what was a reality and what was causing those issues.
yeah.
So we are at our end. Do you have final last statement? Because this is it.
Follow us at Campaign for Vermont. Sign up for our newsletter. We're covering all of this stuff in detail, both the Act 40 or Act 73 task force and what's happening in the legislature. You can sign up for that newsletter at campaignforvermont.org.
Thank you so much. This is so valuable. This information is great. Look forward to having you back on, and I look forward to inviting the task force and getting them on board here, and we can really let the constituents know what's going on. So thank you for joining Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Joy Sullivan on NEK-TV. Thank you, NEK-TV, and we will see you next week.